Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on Windriders. As I always do in these videos, I'll talk about what they are, their role on the table, obstacles to using them effectively, and the most efficient synergies and strategies for getting the best results in competitive play. But before I do, I'm going to say something that I don't usually say until the end of these videos, which is that my patrons enjoy both early access to my content and the opportunity to participate in an exclusive Discord where we discuss tactics, lore, and all things Craft World Eldar. If you're interested in joining, please follow the link in the video description. And even if you don't want to become a Patreon, it really helps me out if you click like and leave a comment or subscribe if you've not already done so. Okay, Windriders. So conceptually, Windriders are enormously straightforward. They are guardians on jet bikes. They use up a fast attack slot, and they appear in squads of 3 to 9. Each model can choose from one of 3 different loadouts. They either keep their default, which is a set of twin-linked shuriken catapults, or for 10 points, they can switch out those shuriken catapults for either a scatter laser or a shuriken cannon. Because of the versatility and the squad size and the loadout, and because Windriders can be significantly enhanced with sub-faction bonuses, stratagems, and psychic powers, there are a wide variety of ways to use these models effectively in competitive play. Depending on the way you put the squad together, Bike Guardians can be a fast, cheap utility unit for scoring secondaries and baiting the enemy and move blocking, or if you build them in another way, they can be powerful target elimination units that terrorize the midfield. There's even a build where they're essentially like slippery backfield artillery, although this is probably the least competitive way to run them at the moment. I'm going to talk about all 3 of these options, but before I do, a quick review of the datasheet. Windriders are biker models with a 32mm base, a movement characteristic of 16, and the ability to ride the wind, meaning that when they advance, they always move an additional 6 inches, taking them to a 22-inch move. The small base size, I don't usually mention base size, but the small base size is important here because it makes it much easier to hide and maneuver Windriders than it is to hide and maneuver Shining Spears or Shroud Runners, which are the other bikes that take up fast attack slots, besides Vipers, which, because they're vehicles, it's not surprising that they have the larger base. Those enormous footprints on bikes can be a tricky restriction to work with. Windriders don't have that. Windriders have modest durability with a toughness characteristic of 4, 2 wounds, and a 3+ save. They also have battle focus, which normally I don't point out, but it is worth noting simply because there are no other units in the Codex that can have so many heavy weapons in a squad and still make a battle focus move out of line of sight. If you are about to write, well, technically, Rangers could have 10 because the long rifle is technically a heavy weapon. I'm going to paraphrase what J.R.R. Tolkien famously told an American who asked him why the Eagles didn't just fly Frodo to Mount Doom in the first place. Shut up. No. Yes, you're totally right. But like most comments that are best preceded by the phrase, well, technically, that one kind of misses the point, right? Yes, technically scout rifles are heavy weapons, but not really. The ability to open fire with 9 shuriken cannons or 9 scatter lasers and then disappear out of line of sight is significant, especially when it's combined with those other enhancements. And that's another, when you're thinking about Windrider durability, the fact that they can battle focus is probably the single most important tool they have to stay alive, right? So it's less about their T4 3-up save and more about their hit and run. Lastly, Windriders have an ability called Swift Demise, which allows them to reroll 1s to hit with those shuriken catapults against enemy units on objective markers. Note, this is only with the catapults. Swift Demise does not apply to other loadouts. But it does give the cheapest Windrider build additional utility for clearing light infantry off of objectives, which is one of the things that they're good for. It's also worth noting that Windriders are a core unit and have the Guardian keyword, which grants them access to some powerful stratagems, which enhance their shooting. Although Bike Elves don't appear in every competitive list, Windriders are a highly competitive unit that can find a place in most rosters if you want them to. although they tend to only be target elimination tools in lists using the subfaction bonus Hail of Doom, right? The big unit of Windriders that's there to take out dangerous enemies, that's typically only a Hail of Doom build. We'll talk about that. But small units of bikes are highly versatile and can be effective in a list from any craft world, which is great because they come default in the patrol box. So if you bought a combat patrol box, there are 6 Windriders in there, which I find kind of surprising. I think 3 would have made sense. 6 is a lot. So a lot of you out there are probably sitting on Windrider models that maybe you don't know what to do with. And the good news is that they really can fit into any roster. Okay, we're going to start by talking about the MSU build. MSU, for you newbies, means minimum sized units. These 3 elf squads are jack of all trade toolkit units. So you've got 3 bikes with 6 shuriken catapults between them. One of these squads or 2 of these squads provide highly cost efficient benefits. And they're kind of disposable, which is nice. Also, because so many Craft Worlds units are expensive, it's hard to find a squad that for 60 points. If you have 60 points left over, there's not a whole lot you can put in your army for that. It's like 1 platform, 1 Viper, 3 Windriders. Even a unit of Rangers is a little bit more expensive than that. So it's nice that they can use up some extra points too. MSU Windriders are efficient for harassing and trading, for secondary scoring, for move blocking, and for baiting. This is the most, ironically, sophisticated and complicated Windrider build. The big squads of target elimination Windriders are very straightforward. It's these MSU jack of all trade squads that require real finesse on the part of the player to get the most out of them. So we'll talk about all those different roles. By harassing and trading, what I mean is the ability for Windriders to position themselves exactly where your opponent does not want them to be in order to put the hurt on something soft and vulnerable, or perhaps finish off something tough with just a couple of wounds remaining that's trying to hide totally out of line of sight. Because they can move 22 inches and still fire the shuriken catapults without penalty, Windriders pose a serious threat to units that would otherwise be pretty safe. And although bike guardians are not hard hitting enough to be as dangerous as a trading unit being one of those units that you kill something with and then it dies, they're certainly not as hard hitting as something like Banshees, which not even close, which put out 22 attacks. My last video is about Banshees, and can run through a rune into your opponent's backfield. They charge 22 inches. But Windriders, even though they're not hard hitting in that way, they're often more efficient than something like Banshees for eliminating chaff units that are hiding on backfield objectives because of simple economics. So consider a matchup against Chaos Space Marines, which are a really powerful army right now. Most units in a Chaos Space Marine army are expensive, melee-oriented elite units. That's the bulk of the army. So most CSM players rely on being able to push into the middle of the table while leaving a couple of 50-point units of cultists in the backfield to hold on to objectives and also screen out the backfield if you have deep strikers. Now, you really don't want to trade your 110-point of super juiced Banshees for a squad of 50-point cultists if you can help it. Yes, taking that backfield objective is huge. It could swing the whole game in your favor. And so if the only way to do that is to trade your Banshees, it's probably worth doing. But you probably need those Banshees, or you'd certainly like to be able to use those Banshees elsewhere on the table to kill the grotesquely corrupted Space Knights bearing down on the midfield objectives. So instead, your 60-point unit of Windriders can nip into the opponent's deployment zone, light up the misguided fanboy cultists, and even 3 Windriders can do some real damage. If you spend a CP on Bladestorm, which grants them exploding 6s, on top of the fact that they're already re-rolling 1s when they're targeting that unit on an objective, then potentially explode into further 6s, they can do some real damage. And then depending on what craft world you're running, there may be other options. Oathway Windrunners have access to Discipline of the Black Guardians, which mean they hit on 2s. So at that point, you're hitting on 2s, re-rolling 1s, 6s are exploding, you're going right through light armor. You can really mess that squad up hard. Now, keep in mind also that having a tool like Windriders, like 60-point Windriders in your army, or 80 points, if you put one more bike in there, your odds of picking that squad up entirely increase. Even if you don't do this, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not earning their keep in each game. Merely the threat of having speed elves in your roster might be enough to force your opponent in that Chaos Space Marine matchup to hold a squad of legionaries in the backfield, which then takes pressure off the midboard, because maybe there's some squad of Chaos Space Marines that would have been helping your opponent control the middle of the board that now has to hide in the backfield, which gives the rest of your army more of an advantage in the mid-table. And it's not like keeping back the legionaries or whatever actually counters the bikes. Your bikes can still be used to score, to move block, to harass. They can deal some damage in the midfield and then disappear out of line of sight with battle focus. On the other hand, those legionaries that withdrew to the backfield to prevent your bikes from moving into the backfield aren't really doing anything. So in more sophisticated competitive 40K isn't just about what you're killing. It's about playing the game in such a way that enables you to prevent your opponent from using his or her toolbox to maximum effect, while you are able to use all of your tools in ways that eventually win you the game. And Windriders are an excellent tool for that. And sometimes it's just the threat of being able to do the thing, right, that makes that possible. All right, we're going to talk about some of the other things MSU Windriders can do. Move blocking. Sometimes the best use for a 60-point bike squad is to fly them straight into the path of a dangerous enemy to tie them up in the backfield. So we're talking about Chaos Space Marines in this video for some reason. I don't know why they're on my mind. I think Thousand Suns in particular are just a brutal matchup for Craft Worlds right now, which if you look at the data over on Goonhammer, they have, you can look at statistics for how factions play into other factions. And there are certain matchups that are just really rough for Craft Worlds, and Thousand Suns is one of them. So Thousand Suns and all Chaos Space Marines have really hard to kill Terminators that, particularly for elves, can be difficult to deal with, that dominate the middle of the table and then lock you out of primaries, but at least equal you on secondary points, and that's game losing. So in that matchup, theoretically, you could make a 22-inch move and position your bikes 1.1 inches from a 10 model strong unit of Chaos Space Marine Terminators that needs to take the objective in the center of the table in order for it to earn its keep and in order for your opponent's plan to work. So in effect, what you're doing is you're paying 60 points to keep those Terminators from moving on turn one, which frankly could swing the entire game in your favor. This also works really well to prevent non-flying vehicles like rhinos from making use of narrow avenues of movement on a terrain-rich board. If you pin a key transport in the backfield, and that might even back another one up behind it that then can't get around it on turn one, you might actually change the outcome of the whole game, which totally, obviously, if that's where we are with the 60-point sacrifice, completely worth it. The other way in which you might sacrifice a small unit of speedy bikes for a non-damage dealing tactical reason is to bait an opponent. So sometimes you need to draw out a more powerful enemy unit by sticking something cheap on a midfield objective, such that your opponent is forced to destroy it if he doesn't want to fall behind in the points. So the idea here is you put your bikes on a midfield objective, your opponent has to move something out that's much more valuable to kill the bikes, and then you can pick that unit up. 40K famous Nick Nanavati is particularly good at doing this with Craft Worlds. He's a really good bait and trade player. So super effective at it. Now, I find that there are two types of players that are hesitant, super hesitant, to either move block or to bait at all with their space elves. These are newer players and highly narrative players. So sometimes newer players really struggle to sacrifice a unit for any reason other than inflicting damage because it just feels wasteful. It isn't. There are a lot of ways to get the upper hand in 40K that don't necessarily involve inflicting damage. If you start watching videos on sites like Art of War of really top level players playing games, you'll see that they do this all the time. Veteran competitive players don't blink at sacrificing units for superior position and board control. It wins games. So in terms of tactical concerns, I'm telling you that this is a real thing. It absolutely makes sense, even if it's a little bit counterintuitive, especially if you're coming back to the game having not played since second or third edition, when it was a very different set of tactics that won games. To you narrative players who are concerned for a different reason, some of you listened to me say that thing before and you could feel yourselves getting mad. I get it. Central to the Eldar lore is the idea that every single Eldar life is precious. And so throwing away 3 Guardians to slow down 10 Monkai mutants for a term seems like monstrous blasphemy. If you do need an in-world justification, you consider that your Farseers have foreseen all of the ways that this battle can go, and it could be that ordering 3 Guardians to their deaths will preserve dozens or even hundreds of other Eldari lives. Autarchs who see the big picture can make the tough calls, and that might be what's going on here. Also, the fact is that tabletop 40k is an abstraction. There are hundreds of ways in which the tabletop game cannot and will never quite match up to the lore, and there's other stuff. People can't run straight through walls. It's an abstraction. It's not trying to be a highly realistic RPG. That said, if you are playing exclusively narrative games in which you approach 40k more like an RPG than a tabletop war game, that's totally cool. You do you. My favorite casual games are essentially a 50-50 mix of narrative and competitive elements. But I would still ask yourself, if you were a Space Elf Guardian, would you rather the autarch in command of your war host be the kind of elf who will trade 3 lives to win an important battle, or the kind who would rather save 3 lives today, even if it means losing 100 tomorrow? I think that Space Elves have an eye on distant events and are probably willing to make these kinds of sacrifices when they make sense. Okay. Last thing about the MSU Windriders, and that is the way in which they can help with scoring. The obvious thing is that the 22-inch move, and they can move even faster with Quicken, makes them obvious contenders for grabbing hard-to-reach objectives, especially maybe in the late game when there isn't a lot left on the table, although usually your MSU Windriders are not alive in the late game. And also we have lots of units that are good at that, right? Swooping Hawks are great at that. Harith is great at that. So more importantly, cheap Windrider units can help with the secondary game, which is challenging for Craft Worlds. Our faction-specific options are just much squirrelier and harder to max out than those of leading factions like Necrons. So we need all the help we can get in the secondary game, and Windriders are a great tool for that. The 2 best secondary options for rosters that are leaning into Windriders are, or just including a couple squads of them, are Scout the Enemy and Behind Enemy Lines. Scout the Enemy is an action-based secondary that scores you 2 points if you complete it more than 6 inches from your own deployment zone, and 4 points if you do it in your enemy's deployment zone. If you perform this action with any unit except for Rangers, the unit has to survive until your next turn for the action to complete. But Windriders are fast enough that you can probably get them into your opponent's backfield, and you may, if there's any line of sight blocking terrain in your opponent's backfield, and your opponent isn't just holed up in the back of the board, you can probably put a unit of Windriders somewhere where it's not vulnerable, where it can complete the action. And yeah, if they're performing actions, they're not shooting, but that's not a big sacrifice. It's not like your 60-point Windrider unit is a really important damage dealer that you're relying on. Behind Enemy Lines is also good. It scores you 2 points if you have at least 1 non-aircraft unit wholly in your opponent's deployment zone at the end of your turn, and 4 points if you have 2 such units. So in this one, your Windriders don't even need to survive to score, although you'd certainly like them to. That 22-inch Ride the Wind advance move that they can make is totally clutch for this, especially if you use Quicken. You essentially double it to 44 inches, and then there's pretty much nothing your opponent can do. It's really just whether or not your opponent's going to pick them up before they score again the following turn. Even if you do have to position the Windriders somewhere where they're potentially not going to survive, you can maybe simultaneously do things like move block your opponent. By the way, I'm not telling you have to trade your 3 Elves on Bikes for 2 points. You need to make a game time decision about whether or not that is something you need to do. Most of the time, I think when you put them into your opponent's backfield, you're going to be trying to position them such that they survive. But sometimes it might be worth the trade just for the points if it's a really close game. Okay. In theory, Windriders could also help with engage on all fronts, That's the one where you need a unit that started the game with at least 3 models in each quadrant, but not too close to the center. That one, Engage on All Fronts, was once the darling of the meta. And it has fallen super out of fashion in the last few months because as the chemistry of the game has changed, it's become more and more difficult to realize Engage on All Fronts without making excessive sacrifices. So I think even though many of us were leaning into that one in a big way, maybe as recently as the spring, certainly before the new codex came out, it's not, at the moment, it's not what it was. Retrieve data also is not a great fit for this particular unit. It's not that you shouldn't do retrieve data. It's just your Windriders aren't really going to help with that probably, simply because the current version requires the player to roll equal to or under the number of models in the squad. And if you're running small units of Windriders, then that's obviously, that's not happening. Behind enemy lines and scout the enemy really are the obvious winners with Windriders. If you do find yourself in a matchup where you are using Engage on All Fronts, there are times where it still makes sense, then they're also good for that. But I think those two that we've identified tend to be the ones that they like best. Normally, after talking about how a particular build or version of a unit is effective, I talk about obstacles to using that particular unit effectively. But honestly, in the case of MSU Windriders, there really isn't much stopping you from making them work really well as intended once you understand conceptually what it is they do. You do need to keep an eye on the threat range of similarly fast enemy units. If you just kind of get lulled into a false sense of confidence where your elves are always faster than the things that you play against, and you're eyeballing safe distances on the table, and you play a game against something like Harlequins, you might find that your Windriders that you thought were safely out of the way are in fact totally vulnerable, and so that's a thing you have to be careful with. In general, against lists with much more powerful, fast target elimination, your Windriders might not be able to keep their heads down effectively. That's particularly hard on the larger squads, which I haven't talked about yet. You can use lightning fast reactions and fortune to make them considerably more durable, but generally for the small squads, it doesn't make a lot of sense to expend those resources. There's probably something else on the table that needs both of those. So just think about positioning. The only real problem or obstacle with Windriders is that they compete for fast attack slots with some of the best units in our codex, most notably Swooping Hawks, which are fabulous. And although both Shroud Runners and Shining Spears probably are not appearing as frequently as Swooping Hawks in competitive lists, both of those units are also competitive and appear in lists that do really well at GTs. So there are a whole bunch of other units that are jostling for positions, and if you're running a battalion, you only have 3 fast attack slots. It might be hard. Arguably, the most direct challenge comes from Singleton Vipers, because they're only 40 points if you outfit them with a scatter laser and twin shuriken catapults, and they have 6 wounds, like your 3 bikes, but they're toughness 5, and they have the same speed profile. They're just as fast as the Windriders. So the obvious question is, why would you take MSU Windriders over an MSU Singleton Viper if the Viper is 20 points cheaper? And it's a fair question. The answer is sometimes you shouldn't take the Windriders. It really depends on what options you want available and what you're likely to come up against in your local meta. So Windriders do have some advantages over the Viper. Windriders have battle focus. Vipers don't. So as a harassing unit, or a unit that needs to zip 22 inches into your opponent's backfield to make a kill, to shoot with a bunch of shuriken fire without being at a penalty, Windriders are far and away the better pick. They can do those things. Vipers really don't do those things well. As a baiting unit, though, or a move blocker, Vipers are more efficient because they're cheaper and a bit tougher. I will say Windriders, for move blocking specifically, it is true that Windriders have a slightly larger footprint to move block. And when they make an advance move, they have better shooting before they then move block. Your Windriders that advance 22 inches have 6 shuriken catapults to fire with at no penalty before they get overwhelmed. And your Viper doesn't have that. But nevertheless, if the real purpose of the unit is to move block, it's probably worth saving the points. Vipers are more durable against small arms fire because of their higher toughness, but Windriders are better at creating inefficiencies when being targeted by large, powerful weapons like D-cannons. A D-cannon will pop a Viper in a single shot, whereas you would need to roll a 3 and have them all go through and all wound in order for the Viper, for a single D-cannon to take out a squad of Windriders. It's just very unlikely that it would. So there are rare circumstances. Overall, Vipers have diapers. I have children, have higher toughness, but there are going to be situations in which, depending on what's shooting, the Windriders will be a little bit more durable, but not for half as many points. So if you're trying to decide tactically between MSU Windriders or Vipers, presuming that you have the points for either, a Viper, I should say, you need to just consider tactically what you want the unit to be able to do. If you want a broader toolbox and you expect to be zipping into your opponent's backfield or firing and fading with battle focus, you could use the fire and fade stratagem on a single Viper, but I don't think you ever would. If that's the move, if you're going to harass and kill stuff that's hard to reach, you want the Windriders. If all you're going to do is bait and move block, then the Viper is going to be the more efficient pick. All right. So that's MSU Windriders. Let's talk about target elimination Windriders. The second Windrider build. Large squads of Windriders dedicated to target elimination, usually in competitive play, appear almost exclusively in Hail of Doom lists. They're able to use buffs like Guide to leverage crazy shuriken fire into something that becomes truly terrifying, right? Your mass shuriken fire is transformed into a threat to really virtually anything on the board. And just in case you're new, Hail of Doom is a custom craft world trait that allows you to count 6s to hit with shuriken weapons as automatic 6s to wound, which also triggers the improved armor penetration, the additional -2. After a nerf last spring, Hail of Doom now takes up both custom craft world slots. So if you choose that bonus, you cannot, despite what the codex says, select another. Nevertheless, 9 bikes with shuriken cannons, they cost 270 points, but in a Hail of Doom list, they put out 27 shots at strength 6, flat 2 damage, and all of the 6s to hit and 6s to wound are coming in at -3 AP. All of the rest are coming at -1 AP. If you throw Guide on the squad and you start by rerolling anything that isn't a 6, even against a toughness 8 target, your speedy murder mob is going to probably score like 12 wounds with very average dice, score like 12 wounds at -3 AP and several more at -1, flat 2 damage. You're going through most armor, taking it at least to a 6. You're going to do some crazy damage. And then the whole mob battle focuses away, totally out of line of sight to safety. And because of the small bases, it's possible to do that, whereas it wouldn't be possible if you were trying to do it with a big squad of, say, Shining Spears, although Shining Spears squads can no longer be that big. You can enhance that damage output even further by using the stratagem Blade Storm, which gives you exploding 6s. This is where it gets really crazy. So every 6 to hit scores 2 hits. Now that's more than 12 wounds at -3 AP. It is worth noting, however, that the automatic 6s to wound, or the automatic 6s to hit triggering a 6s to wound, doesn't happen on the additional hits with Blade Storm. There's a rare rule in the core book that makes this clear. So if you roll a 6 to hit, that particular 6 becomes an auto 6 to wound, but the additional hit that you generate, you still have to roll that die. It's in the core book. As powerful as the shuriken cannon build is, some highly skilled Hail of Doom players still prefer to run max squads of regular shuriken bikes instead, and there's a really good argument for this. So it's a much more affordable 180 points instead of 270 points, and these squads nevertheless roll 1/3 more dice on the attack, which generates more bonus hits with Blade Storm and more auto wounds, which helps offset the better strength profile of the shuriken cannons against tougher targets. The shuriken cannons still have the flat 2 damage, but certainly into either 1 damage or 1 wound targets, or targets with damage reduction, 2 wound targets with damage reduction, the catapults are actually more efficient. And even in circumstances in which they're not quite as efficient, that's a serious savings of points that probably is worth considering, because, you know, maybe you're not hitting quite as hard, but now you have another 90 points to buy something else to also attack with, and then it's probably a pretty similar damage profile. Both builds have real merit. They're both really good. I will say that I think that if you're running 2 large squads in a Hail of Doom list, 2 big squads of bikes, it probably is overkill and too many points to give both squads all shuriken cannons. If you are running 2 large squads and you don't need to, I think you also need to remember that there are ways to buff them differently. So if you have a big squad with shuriken cannons, you definitely want to put guide on it. But then if you have another big squad, say with shuriken catapults, remember that you can use the martial citizenry stratagem, because they have the guardian keyword to reroll ones to hit. So you have one squad that's rerolling all of its misses and generating in a Hail of Doom list more 6s that auto wound, and then you have another one, the catapults, which are rolling more dice, that are also therefore rolling more 1s and generating more rerolls that way. So keep in mind that you've got martial citizenry. You're obviously never going to use it if you use guide, but it's good to be aware of when you have multiple squads on the table. Or frankly, if you fail the cast on guide, you can fall back on martial citizenry. Also consider that in Hail of Doom lists, even smaller, you don't need 9 bikes. Even small squads have enough firepower to be target elimination units. Squads as small as 5 in a Hail of Doom list with some enhancements can do some real work for you. I've had good luck running 2 squads of 6, one with the cannons and one with the catapults. There are a lot of right ways to do this. You figure out what works for you, and you've got to think also, of course, about what's in your collection. One consideration when you are using those large squads is that they will likely become priority targets for your opponent in a way in which those MSU squads of Windriders in a non-Hail of Doom list will not be. So particularly against opponents with equally speedy armies, I mentioned Harlequins before, those large expensive bike squads can become kind of a points liability, so you've got to be careful. You can mitigate this somewhat just by screening out fast melee units, because presuming that bike squad is going to fire and then battle focus behind a piece of terrain, the big danger is some melee unit running straight through the terrain. So you can prevent that by screening with some rangers, say in the ruins, so nothing can run through into your bikes. Also, durability buffs, I mentioned before, Fortune and Lightning Fast. While it doesn't really make sense to use those on small squads, on that big squad, that 270 point squad, it totally makes sense to invest in keeping those elves alive. Phantasm can also be good if you don't get first turn. You might find yourself in situations where either you want to move them or maybe just pick them up and put them into reserve. If your opponent has something that can rocket across the board and threaten them on turn 1, then it's totally worth just picking them up with Phantasm. It's a bit of a bummer to then not have access to your elf bikes on turn 1, but it's a bigger bummer to have them killed before you get to use them, or badly damaged. Okay, let's talk about the third build, scatter bikes. For you newly aspiring autarchs, scatter bikes are the name given to Windriders with scatter lasers. In the first few weeks after the new codex dropped earlier this year, scatter bikes experienced a brief resurgence for the first time since their zenith in 7th edition, when they were obscene. It's been all downhill since then. For one thing, the scatter laser itself, as an upgrade, doubled in price from 5 to 10 points in an FAQ since the codex dropped. And for another, the meta has shifted towards way more armored infantry in cover. And so, you know, a scatter laser might put out 6 strength 6 shots, but with no AP, and 5/6 of those shots pinging harmlessly off the carapace of durable infantry. It's really questionable why you would lean into them, because they are quite expensive. I'm pretty sure that the only reason they even got the points increase was to make Shroud Runners compare more favorably, rather than because scatter bikes were actually broken. And since the changes both to the meta and to the rules, I don't think I've seen a scatter bike unit in a single list that made it to the last 8 of a GT. I mean, maybe there's one out there, but I don't know of it. They're out of fashion. That said, in some matchups, scatterbikes are really good. A max unit of scatterbikes puts out 54 shots and can hit something 36 inches away and then battle focus out of line of sight. This is what I meant at the beginning of the video when I said something to the effect of squirrely, slippery backfield artillery. In combination with guide, or just with martial citizenry, or discipline of the Black Guardians, or guide and discipline of the Black Guardians, or something, these off-meta bikers could easily be your MVPs against orcs, against demons, against some kinds of tyrannid lists, against any horde army that isn't relying on really good armor. The problem is that in about half of your matchups, they just won't do the work. So it's a pretty expensive unit. Half the time it's going to be great, and then the other half of the time it's going to be really not. The other issue is that a couple of 5-elf Swooping Hawk units provides many of the same benefits. It's not as hard hitting, but Swooping Hawks fire 4 shots per model, and their 6 is to hit auto wound, which makes up for having a little bit less fire and a little bit less strength. And they also have significant other additional advantages that if I do a unit on Hawks or a video on Hawks, I'll talk about. They're amazing. The Hawk redeploy probably remains, if not the most powerful, one of the most powerful tricks in the whole codex. So it's tough to justify squeezing scatterbikes into the list, given that Hawks are so good. And the thing that you would be relying on them for, light infantry elimination, there's a ton of other stuff in Eldar rosters that do that well. It's not like that's somewhere where we're hurting. If, however, you do want to run scatterbikes, because they're not, it's not that they're bad, really. We have a lot of other good stuff in our army that's available to us, and just the way the meta is, sometimes it's tough. But if you are going to include scatterbikes, you really need to have Jinx to help offset the lack of AP. And remember that because Jinx modifies your opponent's die roll, the dice themselves, rather than adding to your AP, it gets around Armor of Contempt. So something with -1 AP, if the target is jinxed, is the same as something with no AP but Jinx. Because Armor of Contempt reduces the AP of the incoming shot, but Jinx is not increasing AP. I'm probably over-explaining this, but there's someone out there who's confused. So that can help. And you might be thinking, but Brent, that means those 54 shots would be amazing if, those Space Marines are saving on 4s instead of 3s, or even in cover 3s instead of 2s. The problem is there's too much stuff that starts by saving on a 1-up. So you still, essentially. So yes, you can push some things to essentially to 3s, but it doesn't get it done. It doesn't get it done relative to our other options. They're not bad. It's just we have better things available to us. Also, for just a few more points, you can get Shroud Runners, which come with a whole bunch of other advantages. And so, yeah, you're not going to run a 9-elf squad of Shroud Runners that stays in your backfield and acts as artillery, but you do get a lot of the same benefits that you would with a smaller scatterbike squad, plus additional advantages that are really efficiently appointed since they increased the cost of the laser itself. All right, I'm over-explaining this. The overall takeaway: scatterbikes are probably best relegated to casual play. Big squads with catapults or cannons shine in a Hail of Doom list, and then war hosts from any craft world can make good use in competitive play of small units of basic bikers there to be versatile toolbox units. A couple of final notes before I close. 1, I would discourage you from running squads with mixed loadouts, at least bike squads with mixed loadouts. They just aren't terribly efficient. The biggest advantage to the catapults is that they can move 22 inches and still shoot, which neither scatterbikes nor cannons can do because they're heavy weapons. So you're probably better off sticking with one loadout for the whole squad. Scatterbikes rely on the 36-inch range, so if you have some scatterbikes in a squad with, I don't know, some regular catapults, your catapults aren't shooting when the scatterbikes are at their ideal range. They don't play well with others, really. Consistent loadouts also make dice rolling go a little bit faster, which is helpful in a tournament setting. Second thing, if you are a prospective autarch who is in love with the lore for Sam Han, and you spent this entire video waiting for me to explain all the ways that Sam Han Windriders are the best, because they must be. Surely Sam Han, lists can use Windriders in the troop slot or have some cool stratagem. If that's you, I am so sorry to inform you that Samhan Windriders are objectively worse than Windriders from Ulthwé, Alatok, Eandon, and any custom craft world where they really love their shuriken weapons. That's obviously unjust. Samhan Windriders should be extra special in some way, but they have nothing special going for them. And to you, aspiring Wild Rider war chiefs, I hear you. I hear your cries of just rage echoing across the plains of your celebrated craft world. We just have to hope that this wrong done you by the rules writers will eventually be righted in 10th edition, if not before. It's very sad, but true. A final note. Thing number 3. If you are going to magnetize anything from your army, magnetize your Windriders. It's incredibly easy. Without any special tools. All you do is clip off the prong on the weapon and replace it with a small magnet, and then glue the mated magnet to the bottom of the bike. I am really bad at magnetizing stuff, and even I can do this. A quick shout out here to my sponsor, the Magnet Baron, who sells the best magnet sets that I know of in 40K for doing this. They're not expensive, and they're really effective. That said, for those of you who are magnet shy, if you just want to get these things on the table tomorrow with swappable weapons, you can, as a temporary fix, use blue tack. Magnets are way more convenient and way more effective in the long run. But if you have a couple of combat patrol boxes and you have 12 Windriders and you want to get them on the table and it's going to take a while for the magnets to come in the mail or whatever, you can use the blue tack in the meantime. I did this once the night before a local tournament when, despite having magnets on all the bikes, not all of the shuriken cannons had magnets on them. I had them on the scatter lasers and the catapults. And the blue tack got me through the day just fine. So it's a reasonable temporary fix. Okay. So that's it. I already did my song and dance about becoming a Patreon and about clicking like and subscribing, so I will spare you all of that. I should be back again soon with another video, possibly one on the aesthetic roots of Craft World Eldar and the early history of the faction in the dawn age of Games Workshop, a wild time of weird hair and ugly upholstery that historians call the 1980s. Or maybe it'll be another unit-focused video. And in any event, I hope to be back in a week or so with something new, and until then, best of luck in your next campaign. Take care.